Star Trek's Janice Rand was portrayed by Grace Lee Whitney for a brief 8 episodes. Ratings or budget cuts in 1966 had nothing to do with her dismissal, nevertheless. Behind the scenes at Desoloo Studios, something occurred that altered the course of events. She received a late-night call from a powerful CEO. Getting together. Cover-up of what happened in the deserted workplace persisted for 30 years. She was abruptly let go from the most popular TV show a few days later. The truth would ruin lives and outrage admirers. Here we are not in the Star Trek universe. Just so you're aware. Grace Lee Whitney was born in a Little Ann Arbor, Michigan hospital shortly after midnight on April 1, 1930. She was officially born Marianne Chase. Her biological mother disappeared after signing a document waiving her rights just 6 minutes into April Fool's Day. Without batting an eye at the infant, there was no mention of the father's name whatsoever. Instead of a name, there was complete silence. No one had spoken. The state's foundling program quickly sent the infant to Detroit. She was privately adopted on June 19, 1930, by a couple in their mid-40s and Grace Wilford was given the name. Grace reflected on the day her foster mother celebrated with pink lemonade and a cake that read, "No fooling, she's ours." The joke had mixed emotions for Grace, making her laugh and hurt. She could never shake the memory of her birth date. At the age of 7, Grace's world came crashing down. It occurred on a peaceful Sunday as she helped her mother in the kitchen. Suddenly, her mother admitted that Grace had been. Things changed after she realized her whole life had been based on a lie, that she had been adopted. The word real slammed her like a ton of bricks. She felt as if the floor had swallowed her whole. In her anger, she tore the lace off her favorite dress that night. After saying, "Guests always go home," she began to hoard milk cartons from school and eventually stopped celebrating birthdays. Years later, she referred to her Star Trek hairdo as helmet hair, which she said concealed an abandoned child. She began drinking at the age of 17. By the time Grace was 14 years old, she had a career that most adults would want. In September 1944, she won a singing contest at WJR, Detroit's biggest radio station. She wore a borrowed dress and claimed each drink was her way of attempting to hush the little girl who felt discarded. Dress, and sang a jazz standard. On the spot, the program director hired her and paid her $14 per week, which is approximately $240 today. She sang so frequently, 22 shows per week, that the early morning factory workers who listened to her became known as Sunrise Sally. Local. She had a packed schedule. After finishing her radio shift, she ran to school and then back to rehearsals at night. She slept only a few hours, but she didn't complain. By the time she was 15 years old, she was paying her parents. Grace, at the age of 18, was prepared for more. She departed Detroit with just $37 and a cardboard hatbox, changed her name from Elaine to Grace, and began making little payments to the orphanage from which she had come, in an effort to aid the infants who had not yet been selected. With the hope of not being perceived as merely attractive, Lee Whitney performed at Chicago's Blue Note Club with Billie Holiday, who was unable to perform in New York due to a drug conviction. Holiday was paid $1,000 per week, while Grace got $55. She ate hot dogs for supper and lived in a shabby boarding home, but she studied Holiday's songs so intensely that she remembered the complete set list in 2 days. She also learned to hit the perfect notes after a few bourbons, a talent that would eventually become her crutch. Rewarded her. In a year, she went on a 157-show tour with Spike Jones through 46 states, complete with survival lessons and shots of rye whiskey at each stop. Then she went on a 9-month tour with Fred Waring and his choir, performing in 200 locations and covering 25,000 miles. Grace attempted to adhere to the standards, but the continual travel and alcohol muddied everything. One night she would be singing in a tuxedoed choir. The next she would be drinking backstage just because. Waring was charming and demanding. He drank sherry after performances and demanded perfect manners. To ease her anxiety. As she traveled, she picked several safety tips along the way, such how Spike Jones made her laugh before anyone else, and how Fred Waring protected her from aggressive males by delicately covering her hand with his napkin. However, there were always dangers. Grace learned to trade grins for protection and remained alert in every dressing room. In 1952, she shocked everyone by enrolling in nursing school. She delivered babies, assisted in surgeries, and in one city, musicians bet on how long it would take for the new girl singer to give in to a kiss. Surgery, and she took great pride in her uniform. However, when Spike Jonze contacted her about a new TV show, she was faced with a decision. Nurses made $180 per month, while the show offered $250 per week plus travel. Thus, she returned to her entertainment career, leaving her starched uniform behind with a note. Showbiz 1, it read. Silent but ear-piercing. Grace Lee Whitney began her career on a high note in 1951 when she made her Broadway debut as Miss Holland. She carried smelling salts and gauze with her forever, just in case. Top Banana was developed as a vehicle for Phil Silvers, who would eventually win a Tony for his part, and Whitney played with him. The show opened on November 1st at the Winter Garden Theater and ran for 350 performances before closing in October 1952. She had previously performed as a nightclub singer, opening for Billie Holiday and Buddy Rich, and was now a member of the Entertainment Union, which had helped begin her career in Hollywood, alongside superstars like Rose Marie and Jack Albertson. In 1954, when United. Despite being shot in 3D, the studio released it in normal format. The picture, which retained nearly all of the original cast and crew members, had a $150,000 budget and was directed by Alfred E. Green. This was a rare opportunity for Whitney to join the original Broadway ensemble in a credited film role, thus launching her career in Hollywood. However, she had to settle for a string of uncredited parts in well-known films before breaking through. In 1953's House of Wax, she made her most notable uncredited appearance in Some Like It Hot 1959, playing Rosella, a band member who shared scenes with Marilyn Monroe, Jack Lemmon, and Tony Curtis. She also made uncredited appearances in The Naked and the Dead, 1958, and Pocket, during the height of 3D mania. Whitney subsequently referred to herself as elegant wallpaper, and she wasn't exaggerating, in Full of Miracles, 1961, discussing how she frequently went uncredited while having screen time and lines of conversation. This was typical during the studio era, particularly for women viewed as just visual extras. She continued to work despite the fact that Hollywood in the 1950s frequently relegated women like her to supporting roles, such as in The Texan Meets Calamity Jane, 1950, House of Wax, 1953, Top Banana, 1954, The Naked and the Dead, 1958, and Pocket Full of Miracles, 1961, all of which had uncredited actresses but did little to advance her career. She was a regular on Queen for a Day in her role as a visual assistant and appeared in more than 80 live television series during this period, including You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx, The Red Skeleton Show, The Jimmy Durante Show, and The Ernie Kovich Show, 1957 to 1958. Her first serious part was on Cowboy G-Men in 1953, and she went on to make over 100 appearances on famous shows during the late 1950s and early 1960s, including actress who played major roles in series such as The Real McCoys, Wagon Train, Guns 'Em Smoke, The Rifleman, Bat Masterson, 77 Sunset Strip, Bewitched, Batman, and The Untouchables. She was also a regular on Mike Hammer in 1958 as Tempest Flame, and guest starred on Hawaiian Eye. Marcia Vale was played by Whitney Houston. Her 1953 appearance with Groucho Marx demonstrated that she could hold her own in terms of sharp humor and rapid wit. Her big break came in early 1966, when Gene Roddenberry was casting for a new science fiction show. Whitney had previously worked with Roddenberry on a police story pilot, which helped her land an audition for Star Trek. Roddenberry was looking for a strong-looking, soft-spoken, professionally talked-about actress, and Whitney was the perfect fit. With a background in nursing and experience under her belt, Whitney possessed the ideal combination of these traits. She had a background in live performance and had collaborated with musical greats like Billie Holiday and Fred Waring. In the role of Iman Janice Ram, assistant to the captain on board the USS Enterprise, she was cast. However, her contract was only for 8 episodes before it was terminated. Major roles were hers in episodes such as Charlie X, Mary, and The Enemy Within. In Charlie X, she portrayed the role of a young guy obsessed with superpowers, and in The Enemy Within, she had to fight off an evil Captain Kirk. Her last episode was. Roddenberry had envisioned Whitney's character as more than just a lovely secretary, but the network let her go. The show began in September 1966 with NBC investing $190,000 per episode, making Star Trek the most costly series on television at the time. The unspoken attraction between her and Kirk was always a part of her role, and her purpose was to demonstrate the delicate balance between professionalism and human feeling. However, NBC management were not fond of this aspect of her character, believing it made Kirk appear too unavailable for amorous schemes involving guest stars. They thought that in order to appeal to female viewers, Kirk needed to appear single and available. As a result, Whitney was let go from the show, despite the fact that she was already beloved by fans. Behind the scenes, something sinister was afoot. After only 2 months of filming Star Trek in late 1966, Grace Lee Whitney received an invitation from a senior executive at Desoloo Productions. She accepted without hesitation, having previously worked with Gene Roddenberry on a pilot called Police Story, and this appeared to be a routine assignment. Continuation. The meeting was scheduled for the late afternoon in a deserted office building. It seemed strange but not suspicious. The man held authority. Back then, studio bosses dictated everything, and performers knew better than to retaliate. Something seemed odd the minute she walked in. He brought her a drink and began to speak in what she would later describe as glib banter, a casual, overly polished manner that wasn't small talk but rather a part of their routine. She quickly came to the realization that the circumstance was more than simply wrong, and that everything about it had been orchestrated. This wasn't a casual business meeting, but a trap meant to isolate and undermine her. When she started to fight back, things became worse. She wasn't just harassed, she was assaulted. The power games in Hollywood weren't merely about casting and contracts, they could become violent. Whitney recounted the events of that night in her 1998 memoir, The Longest Trek, in which she stated how, when confined to an office on the Desoloo lot, she attempted to push him away, but he became more violent, and she was afraid. What had begun as a professional opportunity turned into a nightmare in the same location where she believed she was laying the groundwork for her future, and that was the night she confided in Leonard Nimoy, not because she agreed, but because she was afraid for her life. Although Nimoy initially dismissed Whitney's claims as idle chatter, he eventually became her rock and remained by her side for years. Whitney's life fell apart after her dismissal from Star Trek, and she battled with addiction. She ended up on the streets, but Nimoy remained at her side, urging her to join AA and discussing faith with her. He assisted her in getting back on her feet. They had a link that went beyond the act, based on something very painful and human, and they never once mentioned the man who had done it, even though she would later claim that she might not have lived without him. "This is my story, not his," Whitney would consistently state. She never mentioned him once in her book, and Nimoy did the same. They were silent throughout their lives, and it wasn't because they weren't concerned. Silence protected the wrong person while destroying the one who had been wounded. It lasted only days because they were scared of what would happen if they spoke out. The man had authority, and speaking out could lead to litigation, blacklisting, and worse. Following the attack, her agency received the call. Whitney was let go on September 8, 1966, the very day Star Trek premiered. This was more than just a job. It was the greatest opportunity she had ever lost. She had shot Star Trek. She had already been in multiple episodes and was set to appear in even more. The production even extended her stay on set beyond the duration of her contract. Then, out of nowhere, she vanished without a trace. Hollywood has a way of severing ties with people as if they had never existed. NBC claimed that her character, Janice, made Captain Kirk appear to be in a relationship, which they felt would be detrimental to the show. As a result, Kirk needed a consistent companion, someone to flirt with each week. They told the press that she would make him look unfaithful, so they fired her. What they left out was the budget problems, the chaotic behind the scenes, and the pain Whitney was coping with off-camera. It was easier to claim her position didn't fit the vision. Gene Roddenberry disagreed with the decision and, in an effort to get her back, drafted a memo shortly after her firing, suggesting, among other things, that she get a new hairdo to make her look younger in the hopes that this would sway the network. Even the show's creator couldn't save Whitney from the television industry's indifference, and he later said that giving in to pressure had been the worst decision of his career. Never give up the power to decide. What makes the story even more heartbreaking is what transpired during her last weeks on the show. In the grueling stunt that was The Enemy Within, Whitney had to physically perform a violent sequence in which Captain Kirk's evil duplicate attacks her. Roddenberry directed the sequence and instructed Whitney to make it look realistic yet glamorous. Whitney couldn't believe it, she later recalled. It was very difficult. The assault had occurred just days before, leaving her scarred and frightened. There was a period when I felt really terrible. She was assaulted on August 26, and the call came on September 8. For 30 years, she assumed speaking up was the reason she was dismissed. It made sense when she was attacked. Decades later, once she had overcome her addiction and been sober, she discovered the truth. The studio had already decided to fire her. Memos confirmed it. Money was tight. Grace Lee Whitney's breakdown following her 1967 firing from Star Trek was about more than simply losing her job. It was about the boundary between her and her character, Janice Rand, and it had nothing to do with the assault, which changed everything for her. Went missing entirely. She wasn't an actress playing a part, she was the part. So, when she was dismissed, she didn't think they were rejecting a character, she thought they were rejecting her. Her therapist attempted to disentangle the two, but she was unable to do so. They kicked me out, she said. She was sexually attacked by a Star Trek executive days before she was fired, which made the pain even worse. The combination of emotional and physical trauma she endured broke her, and she became addicted to drink and pharmaceuticals, joining the Hollywood elite in their perilous cycle of addiction for survival. One doctor, Max Jacobson, who was known as Dr. Feelgood, was notorious for injecting amphetamines into his star patients. The safety of the injections was exaggerated because patients like John F. Kennedy were on the list, but Whitney got hooked and claimed she couldn't stop taking the pills or drinking. Viewed as means to maintain a slim figure and high energy levels, they ultimately destroyed her. Before long, she became dependent on them. Despite her struggles, she continued to work, appearing on shows like Batman and Death Valley Days while seeming professionally despite her inevitable collapse. Separate and private, while the industry turned a blind eye so long as she fulfilled her work obligations. However, this only served to exacerbate her problems, as each guest role offered her a false sense of control while her reputation was subtly deteriorating. By 1970, in 1975, she had lost everything. She didn't seek alimony after her divorce because she believed Star Trek would bring her wealth, but it didn't. The odd roles stopped coming. No one was willing to take a chance on her anymore. His response to her news of termination was, "Good," according to her ex-husband. "It makes me happy that you're embarrassed." She began liquidating her possessions. Those who had previously extended assistance withered away. Her own sons were coerced into helping her. Removed from her life. The funds vanished. The phone calls ceased. She found herself on Skid Row, Los Angeles, at the intersection of 6th and Main. This wasn't a transient situation. She was residing among. She scoured the streets for other lost souls, hoping someone would understand. She found thousands of others who had nothing, including addicts, the mentally sick, and others who had been forgotten by the world. The region was rife with violence and suffering, and women faced horrifying hazards. Night after night, Whitney, who had been a TV star before, was now but another face among many abandoned. Skid Row in the 1970s was among the worst areas in America for homeless people. There simply weren't enough shelters. Victims of assault and murder were commonplace, and Whitney and other women like her lived in an environment devoid of adequate mental health care. The streets were cluttered with makeshift shelters, crumbling buildings, and dashed dreams. A familiar face emerged in the mid-1970s as Grace Lee Whitney, a former Star Trek actress, stood in an unemployment line in Los Angeles, a location few would expect to find an actress like her. Grace was barely getting by when DeForest Kelley, the actor who, Dr. McCoy, who played her, wasn't there to bail her out monetarily. he was there to give a message. Trekkies all over the nation were wondering what had happened to her after all these years. And the fans still remembered her from her time as Janice Rand on television. Kelly, who had been in her shoes, encouraged her to attend one of these events. That chat was the first light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. After being fired from the original series in 1966, Whitney spent nearly a decade spiraling into addiction and despair. In 1976, she followed that advice and showed up at Equicon 76, unsure of what to expect. Fans greeted her as if she had never left, despite her had only made an appearance in 8 episodes, but she was still well remembered and many wondered what had become of her. That one moment transformed her life. Conventions provided her with more than just financial support. They gave her a sense of direction. As she resumed performing with her band Star, she found herself no longer merely surviving, but rather being noticed. Unexpectedly, this recognition thrust her back into the orbit of Star Trek. In 1979, she made a triumphant return to the big screen in Star Trek, the motion picture, this time elevated to the rank of Chief Tactical Officer. However, her comeback was far from smooth sailing. She continued to battle with substance abuse, shifting from alcohol to marijuana while filming in order to maintain function. Upon witnessing the exhausted state of her co-stars, she realized that she had made a mistake. She was shattered as she looked in the final cut. She slid again, back to Skid Row. Leonard Nimoy, who had faced his own demons, recognized the truth in her eyes. Rather than passing judgment, he chose to empathize. Co-star's gesture of bringing her to an AA meeting saved her life. She started her sobriety journey in 1979 and began living a clean life on April 3, 1981. By that point, she had already hit rock bottom. She was living on the perilous streets of Los Angeles, homeless, and addicted to speed from an infamous Hollywood doctor. She had used narcotics and relationships to numb her misery since she was 13 years old. However, her life took a turn when she met a man named. When she met Clancy of the Midnight Mission, her life changed. He introduced her to the 12 steps, which were more than just an escape, they were a new beginning. She continued down this path for 34 years, giving speeches at conventions, prisons, and churches. Her spiritual awakening occurred in 1984 on a trip to Israel, which was not intended to be a life-altering event, but it became such. She went on to prove that recovery wasn't only possible, but could be lasting. She described it as a profound and permanent change, as if brought about by a higher power. Faith, rather than drugs, became her guiding light. She became a born-again Christian, but she never said that her faith was a panacea. She acknowledged that her addiction did not go away simply because she found religion. God helped, but honesty and discipline were more important. That balance became the basis of her work. In 1998, she told her complete narrative in her memoir, The Longest Trek, My Tour of the Galaxy. She had to struggle every day and tell people the truth. She came clean about the traumatic assault that had stayed with her, but she didn't identify the perpetrator. She detailed her experiences of sleeping on the streets and how she had once blamed the attack for her dismissal, only to learn that the decision had already been taken. She also revealed her. She had contacts with Buzz Aldrin and Harlan Ellison, and she described what it was like to be in rehabilitation. Leonard Nimoy, who had been there, wrote the foreword. Her words offered strength to fans who read her book and met her at conventions, but that wasn't all. Moving to Carolled, California in 1993 to be closer to her son meant that Whitney spent half of each year traveling to prisons. Rather than preaching, she spoke the truth about addiction, prostitution, and redemption with both men and women in maximum security prisons. The inmates who wrote to her years later said that her unfiltered, humble, and shameless speech helped them stay clean and rebuild their lives. She didn't merely deliver speeches, she offered people hope. She kept popping up in the Star Trek world, not only in the studio pictures, although in fan-made productions as well. She returned for Star Trek III, Star Trek IV, and was promoted again for Star Trek VI. In 1996, 3 decades after her first appearance, she celebrated the franchise's 30th anniversary in a Voyager episode. Despite major productions moving on, she continued to say yes to fan-made projects. Undertakings. Her motivation was not a desire for fame, but rather the unwavering support of her admirers, which she was determined not to forfeit.